Hey, what's been good about your day? It's Mrs. Newport. It is time for story time. We are continuing on with Heaven Changes Everything by Todd and Sonja Burpo. We are actually over halfway through. We're on chapter 26, and I hope you're enjoying this book as much as I have. So let's go ahead and get started. It says in chapter 26 is actually called Waiting at Heaven's Gates. Waiting at Heaven's Gates. In heaven, this little girl ran up to me and wouldn't stop hugging me, Colton said, in a tone that clearly indicated he didn't enjoy all this hugging from a girl. Todd talks in this chapter and he says, let's face it, about the only thing that can provide any comfort when we lose a loved one is knowing we will see that person again. That is such a great statement. Oh, sure, that's not what they teach in counseling courses and psychology classes. When those classes deal with the subject of grief, they say families need funerals as a way to bring closure. For people who have no hope of heaven, that's the best that they can do. They say goodbye, and that's it. All they have is memories. If you don't know God, I guess you can fall for that lie. But let me tell you, closure is a man's plan, not God's. God has a much better plan. His plan is all about reunion, not closure. If you need a reminder of that, think of what Colton said happened to him when he arrived in heaven. This little girl ran up to me and she wouldn't stop hugging me. It took us a while to figure it out, but soon we realized that, without a doubt, the girl who came up running to Colton was his big sister, the baby we had lost through miscarriage years earlier. What a beautiful picture of heaven. It's probably the image that has touched more hearts than anything else in Colton's story. It's also part of the answer to the question we've been asked over and over again. Why do you think heaven is for real has found such a large audience? The fact is, pastors like me confuse people in church. We make heaven sound complicated. We use words people don't understand and ramble on with complicated preaching while folks fall asleep in the pews. But here's a little boy saying he went to heaven and met a sister there. The sister he didn't know he had. When you read this story, you probably respond the same way as Sonja and I did when we figured out who he was talking about. Wow. All of us who have the hope of heaven have imagined what it's going to be like to meet Jesus, as well as the joy of seeing beloved family members who have died. But consider this. It's not just those loved ones you've cherished most on earth you'll see, but also some you may never have known you had. You may have siblings or other family members who died throughout miscarriage, abortion, or other tragedies you didn't know about. Can you imagine the joy we'll feel at that reunion, the amazement we'll have to maybe see a bigger family than we thought we had? One man told us he'd always thought of himself as an only child because he was the only baby his mother was able to carry full term. She had suffered 5 miscarriages. He told us, when I read your book, I bawled, realizing I have 5 brothers and sisters in heaven. Consider how many people's families are going to be bigger in heaven than they were down here. Here's another thing. I love thinking about as a picture the reunion I'll have in heaven. It's based on a detail about Colton's meeting a sister that didn't make it into heaven is for real. Colton told us that when the angels and Jesus took him to heaven, his sister was waiting for him at the gate. He met his great-grandfather, Pop, in the throne room of God, but even before he walked through the heaven's gates, his sister was waiting there for him. Somehow she knew he was coming, and she came running out to meet him. Even though Colton wasn't crazy about being hugged by a girl, after she let him know she was his sister, he realized how important this particular girl was. Colton's experience tells me that our daughter in heaven is aging. Maybe by the time we get to see her, she'll be a young lady. My own personal belief is that we will all be in our prime in heaven. Think about it. Jesus was 33 when he left earth and returned to heaven. Pop was a glasses-wearing older man when he died. But when Colton saw him, he was young and clear-sighted. Sonja was 2 months pregnant when she miscarried the infant we now know as our daughter, but Colton saw her as a little girl. So as I have imagined, dreamed, and prayed, this is the picture that keeps being rewound in my mind about my heavenly homegoing, as I'm being flown by the angels to heaven and walking the last steps with Jesus. A young lady comes running to greet me. She looks like Cassie, but is a little bit like Sonja too, her dark hair streaming out behind her as she runs to give her dad a hug. I don't think I'm going to have to look for her or try to find her. I believe she's going to be there to meet me. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know which plan, God's or man's, is the one I'm choosing. Forget closure. I'm looking forward to that reunion in heaven, and I know my daughter is eager for that day too. Colton has already told us she can't wait for you and Mom to get to heaven. Colton may not have appreciated being hugged by that little girl, but I'm looking forward to it more than I can describe. So the end of this chapter ends with Luke 20:38. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. Chapter 27 is unforgivable? No. I glanced in the mirror and saw Sonja slip the x-ray film from the brown envelope and hold it up in the streaming sunlight. Slowly she began shaking her head, and tears filled her eyes. "We screwed up," she said, her voice breaking over the images she would later tell me were burned in her mind forever. I turned my head back enough to see the 3 small explosions she was staring at. The misshapen blotches seemed huge in the ghostly mass of Colton's tiny torso. Why did they seem so much bigger now? "You're right. We should have known," I said. So Todd's talking in this chapter too, and he says, a lot of us struggle to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we make, or think we make. Parents probably have the hardest time with those struggles. If Colton had died, Sonja and I no doubt would have felt responsible. Yes, we were following the doctor's advice, but we would have felt guilty anyway, thinking our gut instincts as protective parents should have kept us from meekly going along with what we felt wrong to us. So I understand when parents come to me and say they have never forgiven themselves for what they did or didn't do. Maybe they aborted a baby. Maybe they were driving drunk and caused an accident that killed their child. Maybe they turned their back one quick instant and something went terribly wrong. And now they're asking me, how can I ever forgive myself for what I did? For help in answering them, I look at Jesus' example. When people are thinking wrong, we would redirect their attention. For example, when the Pharisees attacked him for working on the Sabbath, instead of answering them directly, he shot back questions of his own. Who's Lord of the Sabbath? Is it wrong to do good on the Sabbath? When a young mother comes to me and says, "I had an abortion. I know I can never be forgiven for that," I try to help her change her thinking. I tell her, "You're right. Jesus says there is an unforgivable sin." Usually for a second she pauses, maybe swallows hard and says, "Really?" "Yes," I answer. Jesus says there is an unforgivable sin. And guess what? It's not abortion. Jesus says the one unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now, blasphemy is a very complicated thing to explain, but let me assure you, abortion has nothing in common with blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. I tell that woman abortion is 100% completely forgivable. Most of the time, the mother will look up at me with a smile starting to appear on her face. "It is," she says. At that moment, when I can see she's beginning to have a glimmer of hope, I continue. I ask, "Do you know who Paul was?" He was an apostle, but not just any apostle. He murdered Christians, men, women, children, and lots of them, not just 1 or 2. "Have you done anything that bad?" "No," she says. Then I see her smile grow bigger. Now, there's the answer. If God forgave Paul, why wouldn't he forgive you for what you did? Have you asked him to do that? Only the unwilling are unforgivable. Is there any sin in your life you think God doesn't want to forgive? Do you realize that the only thing between you and forgiveness is you? This chapter ends with Matthew 12:31. It says, every kind of sin and slander can be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. I hope you do something great with your day and choose joy. We'll see you next time.